today, how to use psychology to increase conversions. We've got out there neuroeconomics, behavioral economics, marketing psychology, all really sexy words out there at the moment in the digital marketing space. And what they're all trying to do is look at the mechanics of the brain and see how that influences behavior. Some of you may have heard of the chimp paradox, or the chimp versus the rational brain, or system 1 versus system 2, thinking fast, thinking slow. Anyone? Okay, so basically popular psychology has this idea that these two systems, that there's one that is fast thinking, that is emotional, that is reactive, and there's this rational part that is much slower, that we consider things. And if we look at it, the brain itself is a really complex thing. And they reckon that it's around 38,000 trillion calculations, or equivalent to calculations, the brain makes per second. That's a lot of calculations. And that is very tiring. It tires the brain out very quickly. So what has happened is the brain has evolved lots of these shortcuts, or cognitive biases, that kind of are very quick and very efficient to try and get around this problem. The brain itself burns around 20% of your calories a day. So it's a very resource-heavy thing. So we can look at some of these shortcuts, some of these cognitive biases, and perhaps use them to nudge people in the direction of converting. So I'm going to go over a few of those with you today. I'm going to start with chunking, okay? And chunking is where it's not about drinking or anything like that. It's not binge drinking. It's about breaking things down into small chunks, and smaller individual tasks are perceived as less daunting than one big task, even though it's exactly the same thing you've got to do. If you break it down, it's perceived as being easier. I mean, who hasn't seen a form like this where you just go, oh no, got to fill that all out, and your heart just drops. You're like, oh. But what Beagle Street did is they've taken something like that, big form, and they've just made it into small, really easy steps to do. There's lots of clicks involved. You've got to do each step and click onto the next one. And conventionally, we're trying to reduce the number of clicks. But in this case, by increasing the number of clicks, we're actually making it easier to do. Reframing. Information may be numerically identical, but interpret it in a different way, and we perceive it as being different. That's reframing. For example, would you go for something that's 20% fat or 80% lean? So they're exactly the same thing, but by reframing it, we're making one seem more appealing than the other. Another example I'm going to use is EasyJet. And you know when you go on holiday and you land on the tarmac, and the plane stops, and you look out the window and you can just about see, just on the horizon, is the terminal building. You're like, oh no, I'm going to have to get in a bus with all the other passengers swaying around. And you're just like, this is not what I want to be doing. This one enterprising EasyJet pilot came in, landed, he's parked up middle of nowhere again. He's like, I got some bad news and I got some good news for you. The bad news is there's someone parked in our space by the gangway and we can't get in. The good news is there's a bus coming to collect you, and it's going to take you to the terminal right by the passport control. And what he's done there is he's reframed it. He's turned what normally is thought as a positive, turned that into a negative, and what is normally a negative, turn it into a positive. And what works best when you do that is by putting a disruptor at the beginning. And a disruptor is something that breaks the flow of thought. And in this case, he used a disruptor of saying, I've got some bad news and good news. So when you're worried about what your USPs are, you don't know what your USPs are, you don't know why your product is different than your competitors, think about reframing. You can create value from just a phrase. Next, the goal gradient effect. So this is where the closer we see ourselves to reaching a goal, the more motivated we are. Okay, and this is the classic loyalty card scheme. So research has shown that if you give someone, in this case, a loyalty card with eight circles and stamp 2 of them, they're going to buy more coffee quicker than if you'd given them a card with just 6 circles with no stamps, because they perceive to be close to the goal. We can use this online. Go back to Beagle Street again. We can use this online here. But you remember before, they broke it down into small chunks, that whole process, where you come to a form here, and you go, oh no, I've got a form to fill in, but look, I've already completed 3 of my steps. I've only got 2 left to go. So now, well, I might as well just finish it. So when you've got a long, convoluted conversion funnel, try thinking about trying to put some steps at the beginning that it looks like you've already completed a few of those, so there's less to do, perceived less to do. The next one I'm going to talk about is peak end rule. So peak end rule is this, an experience is not remembered equally. We remember, the mind is kind of not really great at remembering things accurately, and we tend to remember the peak experience as things that are most intensive emotionally, and the end experience as the things that happen right at the end of the experience. An example of this, if we remember back to 9/11, and that's a really intensive experience that we all remember. Following that, no matter what the stats say about flying being the safest form of transport and having flown many times before, there were a lot of people who were terrified of flying, and they took to the road. So one study showed that the year after 9/11, there were 1,600 more road deaths in the US than before. Is this an example of this peak end rule, where this one intensive experience has influenced our behavior and actually done something that is illogical and therefore may have paid the price for that? Online, we often see we go through a process and we get to a thank you page, a bit like this. We spend a lot of time trying to make the journey as easy as possible so we don't get that peak point, but we often forget about the end point, the end rule, where at the end of the experience, we just say, thanks for your money, and that's it. What can we do at this point to try and get repeat customers, to get them to come back? Can we give them a funny cat video just so that they remember that it was fun? Can we give them information? What kind of links to articles or advice can we give them at this point to try and get them to remember that this was a good experience? And the final one I want to go over is loss aversion. Loss aversion is a big one, and I've talked about it in other talks before, around scarcity. It's one of the scarcity model. And loss aversion is, we are more motivated by the fear of loss, but than the joy of gains. In fact, some studies show that we feel pain twice as much than we do the joy of gaining. So that means if I flip a coin, now it's to say if it lands on tails, it's going to cost you 10 quid. In order for you to want to risk that, you'd need 20 quid if it was to land on heads. Okay? And here's some examples. So get 30% off. You'll never see this deal again. And this is one we see all the time when we're booking our flights or on hotels. Only 2 rooms left. High demand. All loss aversion here. And this one I quite like as well. Want to save 10% on your first purchase? Yes. Get a code. No thanks. I prefer to pay full price. So that no thanks, I prefer to pay full price, is the thing. That is the loss aversion. So let's try and use some of these psychological cognitive biases to increase our conversions. Thank you very much.